I'm Perky Beisel. I teach in the history department, and I'm one of the two co-directors of our public history program. Today, I'm just going to start with an overview of cemetery preservation. You have a cemetery. What do you do to ensure that it remains in a good state for not only the next generation, but the next 3 or 4 down the road? And obviously we can't fix natural disasters, hurricanes and things like that coming through that can cause a lot of damage, but we can certainly have a plan. And so today I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights of plans and that are available, and I'll certainly enjoy having some feedback on whether perhaps us writing up a plan for one of our partner cemeteries and posting that. Let me know if you think you'd like this in more detail for your own cemeteries. So having a plan. This can be as simple as, hey, there's 5 of us who are interested in the cemetery. Our plan is let's at least go out once every 3 months. Let's just clean it up, check on it. At least then you have something. Or it can go all the way as far as, and I'll pass some of these out, you can look at them, are these very large plans made by consulting firms that you can pay a lot of money for, but have extremely detailed outlines of everything that you would want to address. And you can have something that involves creating a 501c3 and some type of organization that will last way beyond you. So knowing that we all have a lot of demands on our lives, you can go from there. Regardless of which plan, there's 5 things that I would suggest that you do. And the 5th one is putting all this together. First of all, find out all the different names of your cemetery. Some of the cemeteries have only had one name, but a lot of times different families, different groups in the community call it different things, and that can get really confusing if somebody's trying to do research, or you realize that you're talking about the same cemetery, but one called it the Smith Cemetery and one called it the Bell Cemetery. And then you realize, the Smiths donated the land, but the Bells are the ones that were buried there. And sometimes that might cause a problem in you doing research and preserving. So talk to your community members, talk to families who are associated with it, find out every name they might call it, because that can certainly help. The second one is figure out how big your cemetery is. I'm not talking about doing a GIS at the moment or anything. Go out there, go to your cemetery, and if you need to get something that's semi-permanent and at least put it in the corners. It could be something as simple as, I'm sure somebody weld together 2 pieces of rebar and put them in the ground that you'll find them with a metal detector. So that should you have a hurricane, something come through, or it gets overgrown and nobody comes back, there's some very easy way to ID, at least the 4 corners or the entrance, something that the boundaries, because sometimes these have a fence, sometimes they don't, and around here the woods grow up really fast, and and the shrubs and the bushes. My students from the summer can tell you bushes are hard to get through, and so you might not see something. And of course, metal in the ground, I'm sure Dr. Avery can give you a lot more statistics, but it tends to last pretty well, and you can generally find it again. And that's really good, especially if you have a few burials, kind of off to the side, that if they got overgrown, somebody might not realize that there's 3 or 4 off to the edge for whatever reason, and that way you don't forget those in the future. The 4th thing is get at least a rough count. Obviously, if it's a small cemetery, you could have a accurate count of how many burials are out there, and take a couple pictures, maybe after your first nice big work day. When it looks all pretty, but somebody could see. Once again, if vandals come out, kids decide to go out and spray paint, or to take tombstones. Somebody's going for cast iron, that tends to be a popular thing for people to rob. The hurricane comes through, whatever. Just have a couple photographs. And this could all just be, put together in 2 or 3 pieces of paper, a couple photographs put together, and give a copy to whichever is your county historical commission, whatever county it's located in, and the Texas Historical Commission. Because if anybody is going to be researching in the future, those are the 2 most likely places. Now you could add your public library or a local genealogical society to that. But I say the County Historical Commission and the Texas Historical Commission because if you have anything that would involve, especially if your cemetery is next to a road expansion, and something that starts to come under the federal laws and they have to research and make sure they're not going to damage a cemetery, those are the places they're going to look. And that's, of course, the most avoidable damage there is. So that's something very simple. It doesn't take a lot of work, but at least you all have made, a good first step. If you want to go and, I have handouts, we might have enough for all of our groups here. I have a couple copies of the Texas Historical Commission's Rest in Peace Guardian Program. There are 2 programs at the Texas Historical Commission. Say you get going and you really like to do this. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Texas's Historic Texas Cemetery Designation Program. This is not the National Register. I'll make that distinction clear. This is a state program. There's really only 2 criteria. Is your cemetery older than 50 years? And is it worthy for its historic association? And really, if it's older than 50 years, you probably can make a very good argument for the cemetery that it's worthy of that. You probably have people who settled in the area, helped develop the area, subsequent people who were instrumental in developing new industries. There's a lot of ways. And of course, talk to us historians. We're always happy to figure, help go, why would this be important? Those are the 2 key things. Now, if your cemetery is designated as a historic Texas cemetery, the pluses are that you get this official recognition, you can then purchase a plaque, things like that. It's also recorded in your county deeds. So now you have this very official also way of recognizing and preserving your cemetery. That's particularly good if it's in private property and the land gets sold. That way the new owners are made fully aware that there is a cemetery on their property and they're not going to be able to build, a parking lot right where they're expecting to do so. The 2 things to be aware of, it does not provide any additional protection. There's no extra laws that come into effect because of it, nor does it limit your surrounding landowners' use of their surrounding property. So, for example, there was a cemetery when I moved to Middle Tennessee, there was a cemetery nearby that was in a pretty rolling field. And, it was an old cemetery, about 6 burials. Well, by the time I left, the cemetery was in the middle of the backside of the Kroger parking lot. Well, because it didn't affect anything, the surrounding landowners. The cemetery was preserved and the gravestones were there, but anybody that was delivering had to make sure they didn't hit this. It was a really pretty old one, but it didn't, obviously it was not in a rolling pasture anymore. But, that's our, private rights of land ownership around here. So those are the 2 kind of negatives. Then what I handed out is this RIP program. And these are if you realize that there's a cemetery in your area that has no caregiver, it's been neglected, abandoned, a group of concerned citizens can come together and apply through the Texas Historical Commission to essentially become the caretakers, the custodians of the cemetery. And their only criteria is that it's eligible or, already designated or eligible to become a historic Texas cemetery. So just look to the previous criteria. But once again, that's not very limiting. All right, so those are just some extra sources, some things to consider, and that you might want to reference as you're making a plan. There's a few terms that you might see as you're reading through publications, if you're researching online. Preservation, that is protecting, maintaining, saving a cemetery. So that's when I talk about preservation, that's this overall idea of ensuring that it's available in the future. And that's normally what, when you're reading guidelines for grants and things, that they're meaning. If they are talking about conservation, that is the hands-on repair or rebuilding, the cleaning, the resetting of all your parts. It could be the cast iron fencing, and it could be the markers themselves. That can sometimes be done with just elbow grease and volunteer labor, but very often that will require at least consulting with a specialist. And one group I didn't list here, but we're hoping to have in our future workshops is Jason Church from the National Center for Preservation Training and Technology, if I have that correct, and I'll pull up the website for you. We've had him come before and demonstrate, and we're hoping to have more, but we have a video already posted, so I'll pull that up when we're switching over. That is the technical. It could be very simple, but depending on your marker, your monument, how old it is, its materials, you might, if you want to do it justice and not do harm, you might have to actually hire a consulting firm. It's better to do nothing than go, oh, well, we'll just glue it back together with this epoxy for, current building, and it and the old stone are not going to agree after a while. And very often when it splits apart, you're going to lose more. So it's better to do nothing in a lot of cases than to decide to make a dramatic repair, and that will cause more trouble. The restoration, that is combining one and two. That is the act of preserving your cemetery and doing these actions to repair or restore it or stabilize it. Here in East Texas, I have yet to run across anything really talking about graveyards or burial grounds, people talking about those. Those tend to be terms for cemeteries or places to bury people. I guess there are pet cemeteries, but we're not addressing those. Places for burying people, the graveyard and burial grounds tend to be early American, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, or up to about 1900 terms in East Coast. But if you're reading about one and you're doing research and they're talking about the burial ground, that's the cemetery, so get excited. All right, doing well. There are up to 8 parts of your plan. Now, depending on the size of your cemetery and your group and your ambitions, you might do 1, 2, or all of these. Certainly something that everybody should do is find out about the legal status of your cemetery. Even if you think you know everything about your cemetery, if you don't have it documented, double check. You would really hate for something to happen and you say, well, we thought so-and-so owned it, or we thought it was under the church's control, and lo and behold, the church several years ago had formed some, cemetery association, and then all of a sudden you have a problem. So who owns it? What is the jurisdiction in which it falls? Are there local ordinances? Now, those probably wouldn't apply for most of our rural cemeteries, but if you're in town, what are the state ordinances? I think George will be going into more detail on that, so I'm not going to talk about that. But what is the legal parameters in which the cemetery exists and that you can work? Secondly, security. If it's out in the middle of nowhere, that is part of your security. It's also part of your trouble, possibly. How are the walls? Are they, if there's an old stone wall, is it stable? Is it functioning? Gates, fences. On the one hand, you want them up. On the other hand, you want to make sure that if you have visitors and tours, which is a later section, that they're not going to fall down and hurt anybody. Do you need to install, especially if you're in a public area, lights, security cameras? One of the cemeteries we worked on in Middle Tennessee, we kept finding golf balls all over the place. Well, we found out that there was a guy that thought it was pretty cool to essentially use the golf course as, his putting green, and so he was just, it took a lot of patrols by the police. They happened to be right in town. And so they finally said, you really shouldn't use this as, your practice field for golfing. But then there were other problems, of course, teenagers and stuff like that. You might decide that you need to install cameras. It just depends on your situation. Research. This is, of course, probably where you have most of the work already done. Are there plans? When it was laid out, was there a plan of lots and plots and burial numbers? That's very good if you're trying to figure out unmarked graves. That's, of course, excellent. Documentation of the markers, and that's a whole other section we plan to have workshops on. What's the material, what are they, what styles are they, how can you record those, taking photographs of them, that type of thing. How was it used? Was this cemetery a multi-use place in the past? Which groups used it? Who's buried here? That's the fun stuff. Number 3 is the fun stuff. For conservation, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier in defining. What contractors are available if you decide to go forward with repairing and stabilizing your cemetery? If you have plans, say you want to build a visitor center or a gazebo or a new road, put in grading, do you need to do any stabilization before you have new construction? Archaeology, it might be necessary, it might be required, you might just want to do it. Perhaps you've been told there was a church with it, the church is long gone, maybe you want to figure out where that church was. In that case, certainly contact, if you don't know, a reputable archaeologist. Either contact Dr. Avery, contact the State Historical Commission. Don't just have some guy that's going to come in with his metal detector and start digging. Landscaping. That is going to encompass not only what is there historically, but what you want to add. If you have a large cemetery and you're planning on having tours, maybe you want to add some benches. Well, where would be the best place to have those benches? That's where your paths, your roads would come into effect. What were they in the past? Well, if they were dirt paths and you're planning on having lots of people or more cars coming through, you might make the decision, okay, well, we're not going to pave them, but perhaps we need to put down some gravel so that people don't start tearing it up. And there's always a plus and a minus, but if you think about that ahead of time, you can avoid potential bigger problems. The other big thing with landscaping is you've got your cemetery pretty, you've got it clean, you've got all the trees out, the grass starts growing, and you have to mow it. Who is going to mow it, and how are they going to mow it? That's probably one of the top 3 reasons for tombstone deterioration are riding lawnmowers. They're a horrible thing. Well, they're great for the guy riding them, except for the fact that they tend to run up next to the stones, run over stones. You've all seen it. The marks, and weed eaters aren't much better. If you can go out, to a cemetery that gets maintained regularly, and if they don't take care when they do it, you can see the whip line. So it's great to get it fixed up, but then you need to have a plan on how it's going to be done, somebody checking in that whoever you're hiring to do it's doing it right. Because over the years, it's just bad. Public interest. This is, of course, the fun part, and this is what Shay and Bill will be touching on this afternoon. do you want to have programs out there? And this kind of depends on what kind of cemetery you have. Is it a good thing? Perhaps you can have evening tours in the summer, candlelight tours. What kind of signage do you need to have? Do you want brochures? Maybe it's just a annual newsletter if it's a small family cemetery. Descendants, what's going on, a homecoming day, but setting that up. And then, of course, lastly, what we all have to get it all done, funding. Are you going to establish a not-for-profit organization? If so, then, of course, that has its own things that you have to deal with. Can anybody join? Is it limited? Type of things like that. Are you going to go to the descendants, but maybe there are no more descendants living in the area? Is there a local organization that might adopt it, help you? There are lots of grants that are available for basic assistance sometimes, especially banks or other community organizations that perhaps have a community history fund that you might be able to tap into. But how are you going to do that? The other thing that would come into this, if you have space for future burials, and that would kind of go into both your legal and your planning. Are you going to charge? Who are you going to charge? Are you going to let anybody come in? From what I'm understanding, there's more and more pressure in some of these rural cemeteries for people that want to be buried in them. So are you going to let them come in? Are you not? How much are they going to have to pay? Certainly that type of information, at least contact information, would be on your signage at the front. And that might be a way to increase revenue, but then again, at some point it'll probably stop, unless you have a really big cemetery. But then that means that much more you have to manage. So there's a lot of things to consider. There are, it's one author, 2 different books that if you're interested in this, I recommend. Lynette Strandstad's Graveyard Preservation Primer, and I have the website you can purchase it from. This is it. There's really only one book, and that's concise and well loved, and this is it. If you want the even skinnier version, this is the National Trust's publication, Preservation of Historic Burial Grounds, by the same author.